and welcome to a new edition of SNJ in Conversation, where we're focusing on a decade of the Children and Families Act. I'm Tania, Tirraoro, co-director of Special Needs Jungle, and my co-presenter today is co-director Sharon Smith.
Hello. As Tania's mentioned, this is another look at 10 years of the Children and Families Act. And today we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Brian Lamb, author of the 2009 Lamb report. Brian is a visiting professor of special educational needs at the University of Derby, and he's also a lead group member of the SEN Policy Research Forum. We are delighted to welcome you today, Brian.
It's great to be here with you.
So, Brian, take us back to the 2009 Lamb inquiry, which was actually one of the first things I wrote about on Special Needs Jungle. So, what do you think were the most important findings from the inquiry? And do you think that the measures that were taken in those reforms to address what was known as parental confidence were sufficient?
Gosh, where to start? I think in terms of the inquiry itself, obviously that took place at a point not unlike today, where there was a crisis in parental confidence. We'd had the two select committee reports. They'd found the system wanting, and we were at the stage where the government really genuinely wanted to know what to do about that. And my obviously very specific focus, though it did broaden, was on what engendered parental confidence and what undermined parental confidence in the system. And I think for us, looking through that, we did very extensive research with parents around information about their experience of tribunals, around their experience of the assessment system. We consulted very broadly with parents and professionals by bringing them both together at the same time. And we also surveyed parents. And what was fundamentally clear was that essentially you had to build trust with parents from the bottom up. And that involved, firstly, listening to parents. And that sounds like obvious and very trite, and lots of professionals would feel they were doing that. But by listening to parents, I think we meant really the system all the way through, trying to understand what it was that parents really felt, what they understood about their children's needs, and how to then actually address their children's needs. And related to that, I think the other really fundamental finding was the lack of aspiration in the system for children with SEN. And parents feeling that their children weren't valued within the system, that there was no real dynamic focus on trying to improve outcomes for children. I think it was those two things together, the need to really focus on providing much better outcomes. And how do you do that? Well, you listen to parents and children and young people, find out what really is driving them, what their problems are, what their issues are, and then having a real dialogue with that, and then making the system more aspirational about how you address that. And in a way, everything else then flows from those two fundamental conclusions.
Absolutely. So the Lamb inquiry, your findings from the research that you've just described played a significant role in informing the 2011 Support and Aspirations Green Paper. But I think it's fair to say that the Children and Families Bill and then the Children and Families Act felt quite watered down from maybe some of those original aspirations. Do you think there's any aspect or aspects that were in the Green Paper that maybe you regret didn't make it through to the legislation?
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I know why you say that. And I think, and to go back partly to the previous question, I think what did come out of the inquiry was the understanding that we had to have a real focus on parents, on listening to parents, and that had to run all the way through the system and children and young people. And there had to be a much greater focus on outcomes. At the time we did the inquiry, of course, we were just, again, not dissimilar to now, leading up to an election. And a lot of what we were therefore trying to do in the inquiry was change the focus and culture of provision as much as any of the particular individual recommendations. At the time, I think it's like 51, 52 recommendations. Most of those were actually accepted by that government. But then, of course, we moved on. I think you can see a direct line between some of the recommendations and where we ended up, even if the context was different. So in the inquiry, at the time, there's something called a core offer as part of early intervention, which was an idea that you listen to parents and engage them in the whole strategic process around early support. And I recommended that that core offer be extended to education. We got some of the way there with that in the concept of the local offer, and indeed some of the information recommendations that were in the inquiry. But you're absolutely right. The danger in the way, both in the green paper and then how that flowed through, was that that was seen more as being about information provision than it was seen about the strategic engagement and really listening to parents. And so you can see all the way through in the green paper and what followed, local offers, school information report, and of course, clause 19, most fundamentally, that there was an attempt to really embed parental views at the centre of the whole system. And I would say that probably, you know, the biggest read through was, and probably the most important thing in the 2014 reforms from my point of view, was that legal right for parents and young people to be consulted at every level of the system. But did the system really understand the purpose behind that, and also how to actually go through that and achieve it? And I think you're right to say that in some senses a lot got lost in translation around some of those elements between what was the, you know, the whole intention of the local offer was it's a strategic tool for change with an information component. What it ended up as in implementation, certainly for many local authorities, or whatever the government intent was an information tool with, if you were lucky in some good local authorities, a strategic back end to that implementation tool. But you know, there was built into it this whole notion that parents could challenge what was in the local offer, that they needed to be consulted, that routinely needed to be reviewed. And again, in some local authorities that's happened, but that sense of a really proactive strategic tool with parents at the centre didn't totally translate into the way, and you know, that's what was there in the core offer. Thinking of some other elements, what did happen was the recommendation around extending the Equality Act duties so that there was an individual right to reasonable adjustments, which there hadn't been before. It took about another 2 years of the sector lobbying for it after I recommended it, but in 2012 it was included in the regulations. But again, in terms of then implementation, it's very fair to say that the Code of Practice does emphasise some of the Equality Act recommendations, but they weren't I think, fully integrated into the approach in the Code of Practice, and certainly not focused on in implementation. So I think there's a very big gap between people's understanding of what's required around the Equality Act and what's actually been delivered. And you can see that in some recent research around local offers, where the Equality Act generally is hardly ever mentioned. There's still a very large lack of understanding around reasonable adjustment duties. And I know when we come on to the implementation plan, you know, that there is now planned to be further guidance. But if you're looking for where those gaps were, I think there's been a massively missed opportunity, especially if what we're looking for out of those reforms is as much culture change as the actual parts of the legislation itself. It's the culture change that was supposed to engender a move to a more rights-based approach, which was presaged by extending that individual right, hasn't really happened in that way. So yeah, I would agree with you. Some of the things have been lost in translation as they've moved through. But on the other hand, I wouldn't totally underestimate some of the fundamental shift that has taken place. I do think whatever the gaps we all still perceive around parental engagement, co-production, those kind of areas, it did set an expectation in a way that we have something to measure how far we've met that expectation. Whereas in theory before, the 2001 Code of Practice said parents should be involved and should be consulted, but there wasn't the legislative expectation behind that in quite the same way. And that was a fundamental shift.
So, and in fact, you talk about the local offer research. We've actually just covered this on Special Needs Jungle, talking about how the Equality Act isn't in there in so many local offers across the country, and you know, how it was never intended to be a list, but it's a list. Most local offers, it's just a list, you know. And you're talking also about parental confidence. It didn't really improve parental confidence, and I would certainly say, looking back from now to back when it first started, parental confidence is actually worse because expectations have been risen. But you know, there's also a significant increase in appeals to the Central Tribunal and the Ombudsman. 98.3% of parents prevail at the tribunal. But when did you start to see issues with the implementation of the things like that within the reforms?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think I wouldn't be able to put a precise date on it, but certainly 2014, 16, 17, maybe because it was partly we need to see things settle down and see what happened, but certainly from the Pathfinder projects through to early implementation, I remember going around the country and there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of joint working. You know, I was one of the obvious people that local authorities pulled in to talk to groups of local authorities and parents that were going through a process of developing their local offer. And certainly in the early days in the authorities I was going round to, this may not have been typical, obviously, because they may have been more interested in doing this because they actually had me there. But there was a lot of intention to see the local offer as a strategic tool. There were consultations with parents about what services they wanted. There was a sense of excitement, 2013, 14, 15, trying to get those implemented. I guess for me, it was more than 16 and 17, you start to see the problems, certainly by 2018, you start to see the problems emerge. And obviously there's a context to that as well, because despite the extra money the government's put in more recently, especially during that implementation period, school budgets generally were actually beginning to shrink per pupil. So, you know, there's a broader context to that implementation. And if you like, they were starting to kind of push against the tide more generally of investments in schools and in mainstream. I think also the focus started to shift, certainly around the local offer, into getting websites up and getting information on websites and transferring information from bits of websites. And suddenly I was being drawn into lots of conversations, and parents were, about what should appear on the website, rather than the strategic process of what services are most going to meet your needs, and then we'll reflect what those are in the information we put up following that, and what processes we're going to put in place. So I would say sort of 2014, 15, a lot of excitement, a lot of understanding that this was about strategy, and then that slowly evaporating as we went into, and also I think, and it's a more general problem about implementing reforms, there's a sense of, well, we'll go in there, we'll put a lot of effort in, we'll have a strategic plan for the first couple of years. Right, we've done that, and then we start to move on. And my sense certainly was, sort of more senior management in local authorities kind of thought, right, we've done that, we've done a local offer, we've got the information, we move on, there are other priorities now. And you could then see a waning of that focus, which I think was only reintroduced to some extent when you started to get the SEND area reviews. And I was very pleased when those started, because you could start to see at least some refocusing and some accountability for what had been produced. And you're right, you start to see the rise in tribunals. think you could say the same thing happening around education, health and care plans as well, where you look at the very early attempts. I was forever going around big training events about personalisation, talk about personalisation. And, you know, scores of educational psychologists and local authority assessors were being trained in personalisation. And you look at the early research from Derby University of the new plans, and not perfect, but, you know, roughly around 2/3 thought the process was good, that they were confident about the outcomes being achieved, slightly less good about the overall effect it's going to have on my family, but broadly a sense again of positivity, and this was working, which obviously you wouldn't get if you went back and looked at it now. And again, I think what partly took over was then a great effort to try and convert all the other education, you know, all the statements into education, health and care plans. You start to get, you know, in some areas, almost these kind of statement factories where everybody was just there being employed to convert them all. You start to get low quality plans, and you start to see the whole thing begin to unravel again. So I think that would broadly be my answer around that. But obviously, I think it's also going to be different in different areas. And this is one of the complexities of the reforms, is that you can get some still incredibly good practice in some areas and incredibly poor in others. So it's quite difficult to generalize sometimes across the whole system and say the whole system is failing. It's failing in different ways in different areas to different extents, depending what you're looking at.
But I think one of the things that is overlooked in this as well about parental confidence is the background context of things like Facebook groups, and where parents are learning more and more about the law as well and expressing their dissatisfaction. And so other parents who might have just accepted it previously begin to become you know, dissatisfied and activated, and wanting to do more about it because they see that this is actually possible and they can fight.
I would totally agree with that. And I think one of the paradoxes is that I think it could be argued to some extent that, if you like, some of the current dissatisfaction is precisely as you say, because in one sense, the legislation and the aim to try and reach out to more parents and create higher expectations amongst parents about what they should be able to receive, and the whole personalisation agenda, as you say, it's actually created more well-informed parents. It's given more impetus to groups such as yourselves and others to help educate those parents in what they should be able to expect. I always used to be very worried about some of the surveys that used to come out, especially from local authorities, saying, well, actually, about 80% of parents are completely happy with the provision they get. And you go into those areas and think, really? How is that so? And I used to talk to parents groups and think, you just don't know, you know, you should be expecting far more for yourself and for your children. I do think, I wonder that in a paradoxical way, that partly it's because of success about raising expectations, about information provision, about being more involved in strategic process, about being more involved in your assessment in school, that's then actually created what we're seeing in terms of, therefore, more people going to tribunals, more people challenging the system, more people wanting better out of it. And to that extent, it may be a success of what's happened, although a rather perverse one, probably from government and local authorities' point of view, than we perhaps think sometimes.
Absolutely. So earlier in our conversation, you were talking about one of the things that you see being really important in the current legislative framework is that role. Section 19, you know, the role for parents, and particularly the strategic engagement of parents as well. And Brian, we've talked at length in other places about co-production, about what co-production is, because obviously it's not clearly defined within say the code of practice. So however we might define co-production, whatever that might look like, that parental engagement, do you think that that is something that at the moment is likely to be a realistic goal, given the pressure on local authorities to be reducing spend? I'm thinking particularly around the safety valve programs, the delivering better value programs, where there's an encouragement to be focusing on reducing how much money is being spent rather than co-producing, listening to parents. So however we define co-production and strategic engagement, do you think at the moment that is a realistic goal?
Interesting question. I understand totally where that's coming from, but nevertheless, I would challenge, as I suspect you would, the whole framing behind that. And this does go back to the inquiry, and in a way it was no different. Especially when the inquiry recommendations came out, and quite a few people saying, oh, engagement of parents is all about motherhood and apple pie. It's very nice as a value, but it's not actually going to fix the system. And I think that's the fundamental misconception when people hear about co-production and parental engagement, is that it's seen in a way as, well, it's a kind of value that's a nice thing to do because we're all in this together, rather than a fundamental, if you like, from a local authority or government or management point of view, a fundamental tool by which you get the services you're offering right. I mean, obviously, I agree with the value of involving parents fundamentally, but if you're looking at these kind of hard-nosed economic arguments about, is this really going to save us money, change the system, deliver better services? I fundamentally believe, but more importantly, I think all the evidence shows, not just for SEN, but for all parents of children, young people in school, that it's only by the really successful engagement of parents, both at the individual school level, at the strategic level, that you actually get the right services. If you get the right services, you're actually going to use your resources more effectively. So if we just break that down a little bit, if we look at what happens in school at the level of one-to-one between school, and you hear all the time, and I know teachers are very pressured. One of my daughters is a teacher. Actually, we haven't got time to do all this parental engagement stuff. It's just too much with everything else we're being asked to do. And yet, all the evidence shows that the better the level of parental engagement in terms of good homeschool working, in terms of listening to parents and listening to the needs of their children and acting on that, the better outcomes children have, the more confidence parents have in the school, the better homeschool working is between the parent and the child, the more successful the outcomes. And you look at the work that was done around the structured conversation as part of the original inquiry and then to Achievement for all the evidence suggests that that really makes a fundamental difference to the parental trust in the school and the outcomes for children. All the more general evidence we have about the greater the level of good parental and homeschool working shows that it improves outcomes for children. So if you're really interested in system change and using resources effectively, it's much better to actually put parents and listening to parents at the center of that whole process, because that's what's going to ensure more appropriate services and the better outcomes that follow from that. Not to mention, it's actually, that's why it's in the code of practice. Code of practice says parents ought to be met with, ideally once a term. That every child should have a plan. That plan should be reviewed at those meetings. And that all came out of the research that we did at the time that shows that is not just the most effective way of delivering education, but it's the most effective way of assuring better outcomes, because the teachers and professionals understand the needs of the child better. The parent feels their needs and their understanding their child is being incorporated into what's happening in the school environment. That's creating that level of trust. And if you're worried about everything escalating to tribunals and education, health and care plans, well, that's where either building trust and confidence starts, or where it starts to slip away. And if parents feel they're not being listened to, the needs of their child aren't being met, the support and services aren't being wrapped around that child, that's when you get everybody moving through this education, health and care plan. So my question would be, how could you afford, if that is your concern, and we can debate that, but if that is your concern and you want to reduce the number of education, health and care plans, start with really good parental engagement.
Yeah.
If we then look at the strategic part, exactly the same. What we know is that the better the level of engagement with parents strategically within an area, the more you understand the needs of that group of parents, the more you provide the appropriate services. It's exactly what happened around short breaks when parents were consulted on that. Studies were done afterwards about the cost effectiveness. And by consulting parents and delivering what services they wanted around short breaks, rather than what the providers thought, it was shown that actually they massively reduced costs around short breaks while increasing parental satisfaction and appropriateness of services. And indeed, the government itself in the Code of Practice states very clearly that that is one of the aims of parental engagement. And yet, again, at the strategic level, there's still resistance based on, some of the stuff you've written about, the fear that actually the more you engage with parents, the more they're just going to ask for more, the idea of golden tickets, Rolls-Royce services, all the rest of it. And this whole dialogue, this really pernicious dialogue around, parental engagement being about parents gaming the system, getting advantages within the system. Actually, the more you listen to parents at any level within the system, the more chance you're going to have of having appropriate services that meet their needs, the more chance you're going to have of winding back on the escalation of tribunals, the more chance you're going to have of, as long as those needs are then being met, because, sorry, there's a crucial caveat to all of this as well. It's that it's no use having that really great parental engagement if you're then don't do anything about it. So the whole point in the Code of Practice about meeting with parents once a term is you identify what the needs are of the child by the parent and the professional working together. You then have a plan which you work on together and own together, and then you come back and review that plan. So it's no use just having the nice bit at the beginning, just like it's no use having in the first year having a good process of strategic plan for local offer. And well, then that's done. It's exactly the same at the individual basis. You come back, you review that. Is it working? Are the outcomes being achieved? What else do we need to bring in here? And it's that keeps the confidence maintained. It's that assures the parent that actually the services are being put in place and that makes this work. But that good sense of engagement, co-production isn't, if you like, a soft concept of, oh, let's all just get together and, have a nice chat. It's actually a very structured concept, whether it's at the individual level, the strategic level, of coming together, identifying needs, working out together how to meet those. And the more you can do that together in partnership, the better off you'll be. So my argument would be, you can't afford not to. The biggest mistake these whole processes can make is not having those levels of parental engagement. And I think the other implication in your question, therefore, is how well is delivering better value and safety valve system going to work? Well, not very well if they're not following these processes, and see it as a technocratic exercise. And if we can just sort of get more efficient assessment processes by doing that somehow, for sure, don't have inefficient ones, but they're missing the real point of why they've got to that point in the first place. And therefore, I think to some extent they may manage to get the volume of the HCP plans down, but will that represent a success, or just that they've managed to shift some need and demand somewhere else that actually isn't being met?
But also, I think that using its terminology, parental engagement, co-production, what it actually means is building relationships on a human level. And I think maybe using those other terms removes it a step from that kind of basic thing. I mean, you've said in the past, parental lack of confidence in the offer for their children at SEND support even has become a major issue in parents seeking to try for an EHCP. So why do you think parents are losing confidence in that very lower levels of SEND support in the school's ability to meet their child needs without an EHCP? And how can these concerns, which are obviously very well founded, how can they be addressed today?
Yeah, gosh, huge question. I think you've touched on something really fundamental there, not just about the moment, but if you like, the whole history of, you know, what's called the Warnock framework. So the statutory piece, the non-statutory piece. And throughout the whole history of the Warnock framework, we can see this pattern where there's not enough investment in whatever the non-statutory part of the framework is, from different things at different times, leads to more parents losing confidence in that, and they move then to looking for more statutory protection. Governments through the years have then gone, and it's of both persuasions, this isn't a party political point, have gone, we've got too many people going for the statutory bit of the framework, we've got to kind of press down on this. And you can just see this cycle repeating and repeating through the Warnock framework. Why does it happen? I think certainly in the latest set of reforms, I understand why, but there was far too much focus on the education, health and care plan bit of the system because it was perceived to be the new bit. And also that you had this issue of trying to transfer everybody on statement over to the new bit. I understand why that happened, but it was almost the wrong way around. What you needed to really make a success of this was to focus at least as much, if not more, on the SEND support offer and say, well, what is it we need to get right about that was destroying parental confidence before and leading to more people wanting statements. And I think if you look at that, what's going wrong in that bit? Firstly, I go back to the context at the exact point that they were trying to implement the system, per pupil funding was decreasing in the mainstream. And so therefore that immediately put a squeeze on the resources within the mainstream bit of the system for all children, and therefore children with SEN were going to also be part of that. I don't think there was enough thought about, if you want that system to really work for parents, what needs to be available in terms of specialist support that might go into that. So what are the support the schools need to be able to draw on to very successfully meet the needs of those children at that level without having to go through a plan? I think then in terms of the school system, there essentially isn't enough accountability at the schools level. So we had the school information report, and certainly when I looked at that in terms of the inquiry, we saw that potentially as a means in a revitalised sense, that it could be an accountability mechanism for parents, the schools being really clear about what they should be providing at that level. Now, it hasn't turned out to be that. You know, you can find one on every school website for sure, but I'm very unconvinced that most of the time schools are discussing that in any meaningful way with the parents. There's again an active sense of a relationship, co-production, engagement, whatever you want to call it, at that school level about saying, well, what should the school provide here? And I think that then flows through into many of, and you know, there's some great schools. I'm not saying this is happening in all places at all times. There's some schools that do this really well. But as a system, we're not clear enough with schools about what that offer should be. And I think this is where the whole interest in ordinarily available and what ordinarily available provision should be available has come in. Although that has now, I think, started to be distorted because you start to see definitions of ordinarily available. That's just what a school does, or it's all the things we do before we get to the statutory stage for all children, let alone children with SEN. The original concept, at least for me, around that was much more about, if you look at that school information report and the SEN policy, what is it that that school has as an offer for those children? And is that what the local authority generally would expect that school to be able to provide for the delegated SEN resources that that school gets. And then to have some consistency around that across the schools. So it isn't that the schools that do really well around SEN end up getting all the children from all the other schools who are quite happy to say, oh yes, you know, that's the school to go to if you want your child to go to SEN. So I think where it's not happening is parents aren't clear enough within the school what that offer is for their child. I don't think there is enough good parental conversation between the school and parents in the way envisaged in the code of practice, where there is this investment in time with those parents. And by the way, where schools have done that, and there are lots of schools that have done it, they've never gone back. It's worked so well in terms of managing, not just children with SEN, there's quite a few schools where they've gone to that kind of structured conversation approach. They've then used it for the whole school because it works for everyone when it works really well, works for all parents. And so parents aren't clear enough what their child is actually getting. So of course, at that point, and if they've not got the dialogue with the school, what do they start to do? They start to think, well, what else in the system is there for me to go to? And you know, that's what I find so extraordinary, that we have this issue of parental blame as parents start to look for education, health and care plans, and this implication that people are gaming the system. That is the system presented to parents. If they cannot find what they're looking for within their school or see the support their child gets within their school, there is only one place they can go to get that addressed in the system if it's not happening. And that is by going to the statutory part of the system, which is currently education, health and care plans. And, you know, so to then turn around and say, well, why are so many parents doing this? The question you need to ask is exactly the one that you've been doing. What is it that's happening in the system before you get there? I think, to be fair to schools, on one of the things I think we should have thought more about, certainly in my inquiry, and certainly since in the implementation of reforms, we put all these requirements in there about parents being consulted, great. Section 19, I was recommending it. What we didn't do was then, or the system didn't do, was say, what skills do we need to require teachers to have routinely to be able to do that effectively? So somehow, again, with the structured conversation, there was a whole training course, a 100-page training manual. And it was a whole course that you took to be able to engage with parents better. Yet generally across the system as a whole, we don't provide that level of training, either initial teacher training or afterwards. And so it's not at all surprising that then teachers don't feel equipped to be able to work properly with parents. It's a skill like any other one that professionals should have, and any other skill professionals have. As a teacher, you train to do, you get guidance, you get chances to try it out in a safe environment before you go into work to actually do it. You then learn how to do that better. We have just not focused enough within the whole system on providing that as part of it all. And then also I would look at school finance as well, in that, yes, we have this notion of delegated budgets to school, SEN notional budget, but there's no accountability measures within that. Schools are underfunded for what we're expecting them to do around SEN. The government have said they're going to look at all of that and what the balance is between schools and high needs block, which is what funds the education, health and care plans. But we still don't know what the answer to all of that is. So I would expect, my answer would be that I would expect more schools, and I'd challenge them to say what's ordinarily available for children with SEN within their school, what their plans are, what they can draw on. I think they need more training about how to deal with parents, but I also think they need more resources to be able to do it, and then to be held accountable for how they do that. And, you know, I'm still not sure if that's what we're really seeing in the reform programme. I think some of that is trying to be instigated in parts of the delivering best value. I mean, I looked at the delivering best value stuff this morning in terms of the learning and the outcomes they've got from the learning, and there was nothing you would disagree with, but there's nothing in those outcomes so far that we weren't saying in the inquiry. In fact, I was looking at some of the stuff we did for the inquiry, and one of the bits that was less well known about was the specific projects we had with local authorities, where we asked local authorities and parents to work together on different elements of the system. And through that, embryonic version of the Education, Health and Care Plan was developed by parents in Blackpool, for example. But one of the other ones I got out, I don't know whether you can see this on screen, was Confident Schools, Confident Parents from Durham. And this was produced as one of the projects. And guess what's in this box? A school confidence audit, a self-evaluation tool which schools can audit their current practice when communicating with parents, developing a set of standards for communicating with parents, a school information pack for parents, indicative provision guide, so ordinarily available provision, provision management tool, again, how you would actually do that, a guide about funding and meeting the special needs, how to hold person-centered reviews. So essentially, in Durham, 2008, 2009, they were producing a pack, effective use of TAs, all the information about how to do that. That is everything that's coming out of the Delivering Best Value program at the moment. So there's a bit of me that thinks, yes, it's great you've discovered all of that. That was in the system 15 years ago. We knew what good looked like 15 years ago, and probably a long time before, if you're looking at many of those things. And yet we're still having to cycle this stuff around again and again to get it into the system. So that's a very long answer to your question, but it was a very big question.
Thank you. So you referred earlier to the Warnock framework. It was 45 years ago, I think, doing my maths. I'm just thinking now to the current reforms, the change programme that we're seeing in place. It's still very much based on those principles that were introduced in the Warnock report around special educational needs, around the fact that there is the statutory assessment that results in a statutory document, that some children are labelled as having special educational needs, being on an SEN register, etc., etc. 45 years later, we're still struggling to get things right for these children. Do you think that the change programme reforms being tested are the right reforms? Or do you think we need something more radical? Do you think we need more of a break away from the Warnock framework? I don't know what that would look like, but, something that actually maybe doesn't separate out some children as needing something that maybe some teachers feel they're not qualified or experienced enough to be able to teach those children and include them in their classrooms. I don't know what that would look like, but I'm just wondering, do you think that the change programme reforms are the right ones? They're a sticking plaster? Could we do something different? And if so, what could that be?
Wow. Right. It's really interesting because when I did my inquiry, we had the same criticism when it came out that, well, we hadn't recommended complete root and branch change of the whole Warnock system. There's no particular consensus about what people would want to replace it with. So at the time, we didn't get a lot of suggestions about what people want to replace it with. The biggest idea going around at the time was separating assessment out from provision. And actually, I personally think there's quite a few, it sounds very attractive when you first hear of it, but you look at the experience in the benefit system where they have a national system of assessment for some things, and nobody's particularly very happy with, you actually hand it all over to government, you're not still going to be any happier with what the rules and what government puts around that. And it also, for better or worse, cuts away from any concept of localism and local provision. And I was certainly very worried, well, how would parents influence it if it was then a national system and separated out? And it also assumes that the main problem at the time, there was a big doubt. The main problem was these educational psychologists that weren't writing all the needs into a statement. I think that debate has changed a bit now. The debate's much more about, can you get an education, health and care plan? Yes, can you, and more, can you get the services actually specified in it rather than what's not in it? on the whole, I mean, I know there will be some parents that will feel that not everything was reflected in that,
Yeah.
but I think the dialogue has changed around all of that to some extent. Are they the reforms that will fix what we've got? Possibly. You know, what you can't argue in one sense against more coordination of the system that's already there. So, you know, the idea there's going to be partnership boards, there's going to be more coordination across all of those, that there's going to be more integration between health and social care and education. Well, of course. Will that mechanism do it better than the mechanisms they've already had in place that have been trying to do that? Not so convinced, especially when there's some very good reasons why that hasn't worked, in that the culture between the three services is still different and hasn't been addressed. And actually, until you can change the culture of provision, especially between health and education, which are commissioned on completely different bases, provided on completely different bases, I wonder how much top line strategic meeting of people is going to change the culture from the top down. I think
New
it's at least an
structures in
open.
as well, aren't they?
Sorry?
Yeah.
And when they're adding even more structures in with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
tailored lists and the local boards and everything. So it just seems that they're actually trying to make it even more difficult to fix, you know, using a hammer to crack a nut or
Yeah.
a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Yeah, and that's also my concern. That what you've done is essentially, the answer is to add more layers of either very helpful consultative mechanisms to make things happen, or more bureaucracy. And and also, I mean, great that again they talk about co-production within those structures. But what also worries me is the more we're professionalizing, if you like, parental engagement. You know, the whole concept of parental engagement was your parents were supposed to be able to get on with their lives, but be more listened to. And what we seem to be creating in all these structures is almost the necessity for certain groups of parents that have the time and expertise and willingness to be ever more involved in consultative structures. Now, I can't, you know, especially as me, I can't criticize more parental engagement in those structures, but it's only worth it. Well, one, I do worry about parents then being co-opted to be policing the system the whole time. But also, a bit as you were just saying, it's another layer of structure to make the system work. Why can't we make the system work in a more seamless way without all these extra structures? Are they just another indication that something is wrong with the core of the system that needs fixing? And certainly for me, if you really want to fix a system, you've got to have more alignment at the service level. So, you know, actually look at aligning budgets, if not merging them eventually, between education and health, where it touches, and between education, health and social care, and actually aligning some of the service philosophies behind that. I can still remember going to local authorities. You talk to the social care team, and they're utterly bemused at the type of assessment that takes place on the education side, because I was literally told time and time again, those aren't proper assessments. In a social care setting, those aren't proper assessments at all. And, you know, from the education psychology side, they look at social care and a certain level of bemusement. So how do we you know, we have education, health and care plans, but they're not genuinely one plan even now. They're the collation of a number of different bits and pieces into one plan. And, you know, that's not to knock what they're now trying to do with the more streamlined education, health and care plan. I think it really is important to have more consistency across that plan. But again, is that consistency isn't going to sort some of the underlying issues about the different cultures between the different bits of the system. So I have quite sympathy for the concerns that the same with national standards. Who could be against national standards? And well, you could
Well,
be.
as long as they're accountable and backed by law, but
Exactly.
we've got those laws already. You know?
Exactly. So it's still not clear to me how and in what ways they're going to be different from what we're requiring in the current laws that exist. I think practitioner standards could be useful, but again, you know, we've been doing some work around those, and it would be good if they exemplify what's already there. But in many areas of SEN, there already are practitioner standards. So if you can bring them together in a more useful and helpful way that supports the system to understand better the needs of children and meet them, then great. So I guess my overall kind of take on this is that in principle, there's a lot of things there that if they were all made to work properly could be very good, but are they addressing some of the underlying issues? I'm not so sure. And I think what's missing, despite the fact there's a lot of emphasis on parental engagement, I think you can really see how much it has been embedded, you know, everything all the way through. And yes, parents will be engaged, and parents and young people will be engaged. And so, you know, that bit's great. But I go back to what I was saying about the capacity then of those parents to be engaged. So, and again, I would criticize in my own choir about this a bit. We said that parents need to do a lot, you know, need to be involved a lot more. But then if you look at it at that strategic level, who's going to support all these parents and all these boards? Who's going to give them the training? Who's going to give them the time off to be able to do all of that, to make sure there's enough broad level of voices from those parents that maybe don't often get the opportunity and chance to be engaged in those processes? Who's going to make sure their voice is included in all of this as well? Because again, if there is an issue about it, it's the more professionalized middle class parents that can have more voice in the system. The answer isn't to say parents therefore should have less voice or you should tamp those voices down. The answer is to say, well, okay, if you're really concerned about more equity in the system then in terms of those voices, what are you going to do? Invest time in those other parents groups that do have a voice, do have a view. I've worked with lots of those parent groups, you know, in very deprived areas of the country, and they're amazing and they do amazing things. But who's supporting them to do more and have more of a national voice as well? And so for me, that would be the bit that's still missing in some of this, is where is the actual programme? And, you know, and I'm sorry, I'm well aware of the support the parent care firms already get from government. You know, I'm not knocking any of that, but you know, that should be bigger. But it should also be extending that voice as well to other areas and supporting the parents that have got to do all of that. I think another area where they're doing some stuff, I referred to this earlier, is around the Equality Act. You know, I think if you, the big gap in all of this, if you've taken on board we need to invest more in the sense support bit, the other big thing I think you could do, and it's the answer to your longer term, where should this go? I think over time, and it is over time, we ought to be shifting much more into the equality rights framework. And this is an opportunity to start doing that. And I know there's going to be more guidance about what's there at the moment. But if you really want to look at changing the system away from the Warnock framework, and I don't think it's some kind of quick break with it, but over time, I would want to focus much more on the Equality Act framework, about enhancing that, about training people around that, about looking more to, you know, the International Classification of Disabilities definition, and away from a SEN one, much more to a rights basis with the idea of breaking down barriers rather than a needs-led basis that's the Warnock framework. And I think that would be little steps, and it starts with focusing much more on reasonable adjustments duty. And I know there's a group of children with SEN that aren't covered by that disability definition, so maybe at some point you have to start looking at that. You have to start breaking down the barrier that there's a statutory bit and a non-statutory bit, because the reason, and that's what the reasonable adjustments does, that's why it's so important. You have an individual right to reasonable adjustment. That doesn't depend on which bit of the system you sit in. Either you do have a right to reasonable adjustment because of your disability to meet your learning needs, or you don't. And I think culturally, it would also change the perception, because the problem with the needs-based one is everything you've just been saying in your question about how it then positions children. It's about whether we give people something or not. Do they meet these criteria? It's a rights-based approach. It's just, have you got a disability that meets this? Is there a barrier to your learning? Yes to those two things, then there is a financial test, the reasonableness. So it's not just an open checkbook for everybody to get everything, for better or worse. But that would be the objection otherwise. But culturally, I think this is as important. This is what is coming through, even the delivering better value stuff, is that there's cultural issues under all of this about how we value children with SEN and how we value parents. But I don't think this would happen overnight. I think it's about changing the emphasis in the system, getting to a point where you start to say, hang on, maybe we need to change the definition, that the practice is so well established in terms of you're starting to look at barriers and rights. We would need to make sure that all the children that are currently included are included in all of that. I'm interested, I don't know very much about the Wales changes, but I am interested in having looked at those, that they seem to be, that's all been set within the children's rights framework as an overall framework.
Although to all accounts, they are not going that well on the ground.
No, I was about to say, having said that, I've then read some stuff that's saying it's not going so well on the ground, and that's a lot to do with I think the change definition, and that's now covered a lot less children, and now they're a bit concerned about, well, actually, have they disenfranchised these number of children, or is that just because they were over-identified, discussed? And I've no way know enough about the Welsh situation to answer any of those. I just think it's interesting in terms of your question. Are there other systems we should be looking at? It's interesting that Wales have started to try and make a move towards a more rights-based approach. Whether going to additional learning needs as a kind of concept is the right thing to do, I'm not sure. So I'm not saying yes, let's all go down the Welsh
but there are options.
It may or may not be. It'd be interesting to see how all that pans out, and that may give us some idea about where we should be going in terms of all of that. But also, I think the way they've basically, as I understand it, have said that if you have an additional learning needs, you get a plan, and then that plan is enforceable. So it looks like, in one sense, they're trying to break down the statutory versus the non-statutory bit, and just say, if you get a plan, it's in there. Of course, in the English system, you're supposed to have a plan, whether you're in the statutory bit or not.
Of course.
And to go back to the previous question, that would also be part of my answer, that every child with SEN should have a plan. Every parent should understand what's in that plan, and everybody should be working to that plan. And if we could get a sense you had a plan in the system and that your needs were being recognised, that might also help in terms of, and indeed some local authorities have done that. They have one local authority working with had something called a one plan, and it went from the minute your child was identified with SEN, you went so far through, and then that one plan might change into a statutory plan at some point. There's a sense that there was a plan for the child all the way through. So that would essentially be my answer in terms of the system, that we try and move, but over a very long period of time. I don't think this can just be to a more rights-based approach from the whole system.
Well, we could actually keep talking about this, and it's like a free education, really, with not just this podcast, but the other ones that we've done. So I hope everybody takes the time to listen to it. But Brian Lamb, thank you very much for joining us today as we're looking back on a decade of the Children and Families Act. And we really do thank you for everything that you've achieved yourself that has go on to help children and families.
No, thank you. It's been great to talk to you both, as always.
Thank you. So please do subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening. And if at all possible, a small donation would be very welcome to help us keep going.
Keep the lights on. Thanks once again, Brian, for joining us in this incredibly, really informative podcast. Thank you.